Welcome to Dead Man Talking.
Hello from Oklahoma. My name is Edward Ed Smith. As an author here at DMT's Forest of Fear, I am honored to be a part of TeamFEAR and love writing stories about subjects that I've always had an interest in or a special attachment to. So thanks to the listeners and all the members of the channel for participating in my insanity. And now, with another frightening tale from TeamFEAR's list of great authors, your host and narrator, here's Luke.
The Ape Men of Ape Canyon. Ed's version. Let's get straight into that. Note from the author. This is a retelling of the famous Ape Canyon attack on the gold miners in the Mount St. Helens area, and is not a by-the-book representation of the actual occurrences of the July 16th, 1924 incident. So, let's just put it this way. Ape men be tripping. The Pacific Northwest, with its sweeping vistas of natural bounty, from the abundance of natural resources to recreational galleries of wonder and enjoyment, is a powerful testament to the forces of nature on our planet. However, when it comes to one narrow deep gorge on the side of the most violent volcanic explosion on the North American continent in recent memory, then it becomes problematic at best, and the mystery begins. The year is 1924. The hunt for gold up and down the west coast has been raging for many decades. But for Fred Beck and Gabe Langley, Jeb Baker, Todd Wheeler, Dan Wilson, and Colt Jefferson, the adventure and quest for the fortune of a lifetime is now in full swing. The men have been on the hunt for 6 years now, and with some small successes and grand disappointments. They now have the stage set for the strike of a decade. The last 6 years the men have been developing not only their mining exploration of the area, but they have been building a support site, and with a cabin and a horse and mule barn as well. They began with a minimal tent camp and have made several comfortable upgrades. All things considered, a reasonable existence for themselves, as far as living and working in the mining business. Having had several brushes with mountain lions and bears from time to time, preying on the mules and horses, it has been a smooth operation so far, except for the prowlers, both at the mine and the cabin site. And the prowlers really have not taken anything, but it's the timing of the visits and, well, they're just not sure who they are. The men have never been able to catch them at any of their mischief, and by what Colt said, they're almost like ghosts. The men have been working the Vanderlite mine for 18 months at the new shaft, and that is located about 3/4 of a mile from the cabin, and they had to cut a new path to travel to the shaft and move supplies in and hopefully the gold ore out, and this took them about 4 months in the fall and winter seasons. It was tough and punishing work, but it sure pays off during the spring rains, and with stash points for supplies and temporary shelters, it's a great way to start the day and end a hard day's work. And the shaft was braced, the block tied with large timbers that was cut from the construction of the improved trail. Why labor to cut more timber when you already have large timber on the ground? At roughly 400 feet into the mountain, the men had found enough evidence of gold deposits that it would have been just within feet of the current location on the draw. Water was essential to the survival of the men, horses and mules, so the location of the cabin and the shaft required another path that could be followed with relative ease by the pack horses and mules down to the waters of the Lewis River, or more to the point, a calm water estuary on the river created by the backwater eddies. And this was so that the men could fill their water bladders, made from animal skins and some tin buckets with lids, so that they could be packed up the mountain trail to the cabin and mine. And Fred Beck always wanted to find a water source up on the mountain, to see if they could divert the water down to them, or at least closer and perhaps easier access, rather than take a full day to replenish the cabin and the mine's ore washing tables. He went looking for these water sources on the regular, and it was just an infatuation he had, since he was one of the named deed holders of the mine. In a 1952 interview, Colt Jefferson recounted 2 incidents prior to the main incident at the cabin. Cale Turner, well, he was one of the original crew, until he got frightened off by what he called the boogeyman. It was just after they passed the 90-foot mark on the draw about 6 months ago. They had just finished a hard day on the river trail, and everyone was resting that evening. And then in the early morning, when the men were rising up to start the day's work at the mine, Cale decided that he would take the first crack at the outhouse before everyone else got up moving this morning. Cale dressed in his long john underwear and unlaced boots and walked out of the cabin into the twilight of the dawn. He was just barely able to see the trail to the best seat on the mountain. As he walked the 370-some feet to the outhouse door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Always behind him, he would stop. It would stop. But the need to commit to the morning's affairs was weighing heavy on him. And so he just moved down the trail and opened the door. And since he didn't have a lantern, he set about lighting a candle so he would have some light. He was nearing the end of his morning journey when the stench of something hit him. Surely he was not responsible, he thought to himself. And then he thought, man, we need to dig a new hole, move this house and fill this one in. But this smell was like a mangy dog with a hint of dung and meat rot. There was now some light at the door now seeping through the cracks in the shrunken board planks of the outhouse walls. He had seen these thread-thin rays before many times, but this day, something was different. Very different. From the east wall of the outhouse, where the threads of light should be strongest and brightest, it was like something was blocking the shafts of light from the bottom of the outhouse floor up to about a 7-foot height up the wall. He looked and then realized someone is standing next to the outhouse. Or could it be one of the guys that he thought was following him? But why would they be standing next to the house so close that they will be able to look in? And he yelled, "Hey, what the hell you doing?" And there was no answer. He hit the side of the outhouse and still there was no response or reply. He stood up and realized that there was a knot hole in the wood plank at about 6 feet, and he should be able to see who it was because the light was intensifying as the sun was rising. So he positioned his eye over the hole and was horrified to see an eye looking back at him. This was not an eye of a man, but it was the gaze of a beast, a wild beast, and then the huffing growls started. After about the 5th huff, it hit the side of the outhouse extremely hard. It shook the structure of the building so completely that a few of the nails fell out and tinkled onto the floor. Cale screamed as he went to push the door open. The beast pushed the outhouse past the angle of 45 degrees and Cale slid against the opposite wall as he struggled to stay standing. The outhouse rocked back and forth, settling back to its proper position. Cale busted the door open and ran like a madman down the trail back to the cabin. He said he never looked back, but he could hear it following him close.
Thump, thump, thump.
He said is what it sounded like when its feet were hitting the ground. To hear him describe it, the beast could have been only 20 feet behind him. When Cale returned to the camp, he was hysterical with fear and terror and declared that his days on this mountain were over. He wanted no part of this crazy place anymore. He packed his things and his horse and his mule, collected what Fred Beck had calculated was his part of the haul, and Cale lit out of there just as fast as a horse and a pack mule could carry him. None of us really believed him. We didn't bother to go out and check the outhouse. His story was just too out there. I guess we probably should have. Another incident happened about a month before Cale's situation. Something strange occurred at the barn. We had all the horses and mules put up and locked down for the night, but sometimes we would come out the next morning and find the door to the barn was open and the livestock was in the corrals. This happened more than a dozen times, and we would just think either the horses kicked open the door or our prowlers were just being prowlers. But this time, it was weird. The horses were in the corral, but the mules were locked in the barn, and one of the horses appeared to have claw marks on its back haunches, like that of a mountain lion, and there were large footprints in the mud and soft dirt all over the place. Now, they were all of different sizes and going in all directions. We just thought that they were from a big Indian that was still walking these hills. Gabe said that his granddad had told him tales of giants that roamed the mountains where he grew up in the foothills of the Badlands in the Midwest. He said they looked just like men, but big, like 12 or 15 feet big. We all just thought that he was making up the big wise tale and just thought he was trying to scare us or something. Well, that is not what was weird about this. We found a mountain lion laying dead, and with his head ripped off its body 13 feet outside the corral fence and in between the wood line. It was as if the prowlers caught the critter doing its dirty work and they did not like it and they finished it. What Indian or man would have the strength or courage to grab a mountain lion and kill it with their bare hands? We should have known that this wasn't man that did these things. Colt did several interviews and said a few things that Fred Beck did not agree with, and there was some bad blood between Colt and Fred for the rest of their lives. And Fred basically wrote Colt out of his book on the incident. But the next several weeks went uneventful. Nothing taken, some things moved, but all still accounted for, just the usual work and after-work grind of affairs. The work of the mine was progressing well and the men were getting extremely excited about the ore veins that were being found, and the general thought amongst the men was that an actual official essay was needed. And Fred suggested that they continue to work the mine another 2 weeks and then take a large number of samples into Gleason for testing. And Gleason was a gold, fur trade and any other trade overnight town that sprang up a few years ago. That had not 1 but 4 assay offices, so they could spread the ore samples around and get a quality look at their opportunities. And 2 more weeks had passed, and the ore samples were even better than the previous week's samples, and the men were running low on certain supplies. At dinner, after a hard day at the mine, Fred had decided that Jeb, Todd, and Dan would head out for Gleason in the morning to get the samples tested and pick up supplies for the men and the mine, and maybe have some relaxation time as well. After dinner, the men settled down for the night. The evening was warm, but it seemed that the humidity was still elevated from the day to the men. They opened the heavily shuttered windows and allowed the outside evening air into the stuffy cabin, so they could have a restful sleep, considering that 3 of them were going to travel 9 miles or better to Gleason the next day. At about 3 a.m, Jeb was awakened by what he thought was a swooning tone, and it was flowing through the window next to his bunk. It was pleasant, but he had never heard it before, and what made it all seem even more odd and a little creepy is that he could feel his intestines and stomach shaking. He thought he was going to be sick, but he didn't feel ill. Todd and Colt soon were at the same window, feeling the same effects, and then the tones of the sounds changed. You could hear the chorus of harmonies and individual chanting voices and tones. This unnerved them, but they felt secure in the cabin, and the men attributed this occurrence to forest spirits and a ghost of long-gone Indian warriors and maidens. This chorus caused them to still feel the shaking of their insides, but all nausea had seemed to stop. At one point, Todd and Jeb wanted to go outside and follow the sounds to find them. It was as if they were compelled by some kind of strange ethereal force, but it wasn't scary to them. It was just a wonderment. Colt and Fred taught them how to do it, and Fred stayed up and stood watch. And what Fred and the others could not see was the 17 dark shapes sitting on the rocky bluff just above their cabin, some 480 feet to the vertical and 200 feet to the horizontal way away from the location of the cabin. The shapes were just sitting there, silhouetted against the starry sky, swaying and rocking back and forth there on the rocks. Dawn broke over the apex of the mountain, and the humid mist from the cooling of the night was wisping and caressing the cabin. The men were up and ready in the 3 horses and the 7-pack mules for the journey that lay ahead of them. The first 2.5 miles were the roughest and most dangerous because of the narrowness of the trail. As the men pulled out of the cabin's location, Fred told Gabe and Colt that he would be traveling up the mountain to try and locate a water source that would be closer to the cabin, and that he should return the next morning so he could go with them to the mine for the day's work. and the guys started off down the trail. They were in good spirits, even though the events of the previous night weighed on their minds. All three were ready to get away from the mine and cabin for a while. And Fred readied his pack mule and started up one of the goat trails, as he called it. But in truth, he'd never seen a goat anywhere near these parts. And Fred had travelled about 2 miles along this trail. He was on foot and his trusty pack mule, Luke, was following him, and the pace was casual. He was taking in all the sights and was wearing his pistol on his hip and his rifle over his right shoulder, with the reins of Luke in his left hand. They continued on the trail for another 400 feet. All of this time, they were gaining altitude. Fred figured they were at least 1,200 feet higher than the mine now. The trail turned sharply up the slope of the mountain, and the dirt and rocks made the going tougher and slightly more dangerous. The trees seemed to get bigger and taller. The undergrowth was lusher and more vibrant. After several slips and falls, Fred figured he should tie Luke up to a tree and travel up the trail and try to get a feel for what lay ahead. Fred moved 600 feet up the trail and was nearing the top of one of the hollow ridges that separated this hollow from the adjacent one. He was about 170 feet from the ridge line when an enormous figure almost literally stepped over the ridge and into view of the small clearing of trees and undergrowth that laid along the trail up to the ridge. Fred was so startled at what he was witnessing that he pulled up his rifle and sighted it on what he thought was a bear standing on 2 legs and walking towards him. He fired the shot, and it rang out and echoed down the gorge, and Cold asked Gabe if he had heard that. Gabe nodded to the affirmative. As the bullet exited the barrel of the rifle and created the sound pressure wave that travelled the area, the bullet raced towards the target, and what was the intended result happened as the bullet penetrated the skull just above the right eye socket, and as the heavy lead mass began to bore through the skull bone and into the soft tissue of the brain cavity. It ripped into the tissues that constitute consciousness and reason. The overpressure of the projectile's mass and force of the kinetic energy transferred to the lobes of sight and smell. The shockwave blew out the left eye from its socket and liquefied the right eye just below its entry. The eardrums were ruptured and pushed partially down the ear canals. The cranium pressures jumped to unmeasurable levels, and then a bullet smashed into the overpressurized back of the skull. And with one crack of the bone, the back of the entire right side of the skull was ripped open, and the pressure released in a brilliant cloud of red mist. The creature, once strong and mighty, fell as if a candle had been snuffed out, and the world plunged into darkness. The massive body fell with a thunderous thump, and not another noise, other than the air escaping the lungs after a life of 93 years, ended with a whisper of air. Fred was shocked by the experience of having shot a bear, and thus saving his life, hiked up the remaining distance from the ridge. He approached cautiously, and to his horror, he dropped to his knees and looked in fear, sadness, anger, and terror at the body that lay motionless and without animation before him. It would have stood some 10 or 11 feet tall, and the body was massive, and the hair, not fur but the hair, lay peacefully on the body, gently moving with the breeze. The head was deformed by the impact of the bullet, and it looked like it had bristly hair on top of its crested head, and a mane of bristly hair on its shoulders, and partially on its chest. The colour of the hair was a bluish black, with streaks of dark red. The arms were long and muscular. The fingertips almost touched the knees, and hands were large, and had fingernails that seemed to be routinely chewed off. The hands had no hair, or if there was, it was very sparse and light-coloured. The creature's skin was bluish-grey. He was definitely a fellow. The legs were like the trunks of trees in size. His feet were large, and they had hair covering half of the foot. The colour of the feet was a bluish-grey too. There was a calmness about the area surrounding the scene of horror and massacre. The forest and the sounds of nature filled the air and with the quiet and the calmness, Fred realized that the stench of the creature was intermixing with the sweetness and bliss of the honeysuckle and lilac and the pleasant flowers of the berry bush blooms. Fear gripped Fred when the realization that the creature probably was not alone, when he was shattered back to reality. He heard 3 large clacks against a tree that seemed to come from across the hollow, adjacent to the one he'd just come out of. And then a whooping howl from the top of the ridge across the larger hollow. Fred picked up his rifle and ran with a haste down the trail towards his mule, Luke. And as he approached the site of where he tied his pack mule, he could see that Luke was almost petrified with fear. Luke kept looking to the east up the slope of the mountain, like he had seen something or heard or smelled it, and it terrified the tethered animal. As Fred approached Luke, he heard a crack like wood on wood. The sound came from the direction that Luke was looking in, and Fred did not look in the direction of the sound. He untied Luke and began leading him down the steep slope they had came. As they reached the bottom of the trail that turned into a shallower slope, and the travel was easier to execute, a whooping scream like that of a woman being murdered came from up the slope. It may have been 300 feet from them. Fred wasn't really sure, but he did not stop for anything. All he knew is that he needed to get back to the cabin as fast as he could. The eyes of Fred's pursuer gazed down on him as he walked into the side of the cabin from the rock ledge that it had sung its serenade from on the previous night, and anger filled its eyes. Time to say goodbye. As the large dark shadow of a creature moved across the lifeless body of the beast and was joined by other shadows, and a sense of mournful solace began to emanate from the surrounding forest. The dark hands began to gather the body up and lifted it up high, and as the dark hands helped to move it along from the only home it had known, the dark hands cleaning the leaves and debris from its hair and gathering the moss with water, the dark hands cleaning the blood from its skin and hair, as the pod prepared the body for its final journey to the forest it so loved. The dark hands arrive at the area of remembrance that has been used for generations, and with the dark hands they start to dig the trench that will soon be the eternal resting place of the loved, revered, and remembered. The dark hands have accompanied the now still vessel of the Great One, and then, as the dark hands place the vessel in the trench that has been prepared with care and respect, all the power of the dark hands in the world cannot bring life back to the Great One. And so the dark hands begin to cover the Great One with dirt and soil of the earth that has been his home for almost a century of moons. And as other dark hands bring rocks and place them with care over the fresh soil that has been carefully packed so that it is flush with the undisturbed earth once the stones have found their place. The dark hand set about gathering trees, limbs and brush that has ended its life. The dark hands continue to find dead falls of trees and brush and place it until the area begins to take on a natural feel and appearance. The dark hands nearing the end of their task begin to plant sprigs of honeysuckle in numerous locations around the mound of the now brush-buried rocks, and the dark hands having now completed their work. The overseer now lets the swoon of mournful surrender with a single voice. Once the creature has reached the end of its siren of loss and remembrance, the overseer takes a limb of a tree and cracks a large standing tree 3 times as the shapes of multiple creatures emerge to stand inside the tree line, and the chorus of loss and remembrance begins. The dark hand's work is concluded, marked with a song and tears. The night's event was almost at a conclusion when a younger creature interrupted the gathering, and while doing so, one of the elders stepped up and pushed and growled with anger and frustration at the younger pod member. And then, as the younger uttered the strange phrases, a frozen hush fell over the gathering, and the overseer seemed to ask questions of the younger, and only the younger bared witness to the storm erupting in the eyes of the Overseer. Thus ends the Dark Hands Requiem. And now a moment of silence before the ape men flip their cookie. The night at the cabin passed quietly after Fred returned early and was less talkative than normal. Gabe and Cole just thought that he was tired and it was nice to have less voices and bodily noises and odors. And while the sun broke out over the mountain, the men were already at the mine, working with only 3 men laboring, and it was a heavy, hard day. Fred seemed preoccupied with something that he just wasn't ready to talk about, or just was working it out for himself. And he seemed to be constantly checking the tree lines, and it was just not himself. Or in a word, he was really weirding the other 2 men out. At about 3:30 p.m, the men returned to Gleason, early and with reckless motions in a horsemanship, arriving at the mine with glee and excitement as they received acknowledgement that the ore samples are of high grade and content. To put it mildly, they have just struck it rich. The 7-pack mules were at the barn at the cabin and needed to be unloaded. All of this excitement seemed to energize Fred, and he suggested that they knock off early and start back to the cabin. He sent the 3 men who returned from Gleason back to the cabin and began to stand down the horses and just unload the mules, side stage style. And they all would return and begin to store the supplies. The 3 men galloped away at a swift pace, and Gabe, Colt and Fred put the mine to bed and were on their way back to the cabin. Around 30 minutes after the others had left, they were approaching the midway point along the trail back to the cabin, and Gabe said, "Hey, do you hear that?" Pointing to the high side of the mountain slope. He said, "Sounds like something big is moving up there." As the men kept walking, it seemed to get closer. The men stopped to listen, and whatever it was following them stopped too. And Gabe said, "I don't hear any noise. The forest, it's silent." And so the men started walking again. As they did, whatever it was began to walk again. And this unnerved Fred, because now Colt could hear something moving on the lower side of the slope to the right of them, just off the trail. But it was still back in the thick undergrowth, and the stench of musk, rot, and dung slid silently up the slope towards the men. The knowledge of this sent waves of terror across the already skittish mind of Gabe, and he said, "All right, what the hell can that be?" And Fred said, "Boys, I don't know, but we better pick up pace." Well, they passed the midpoint shelter and stash point, and they were now about a quarter of a mile away from the cabin, and this is the section of the trail that twists and turns almost all the way to the cabin. And Colt said, "Hell, guys, we got something coming up behind us. Why, it's running up to the turn we just made and then stopping and then running up to the next. Holy crap, boys, look at that!" And by the time the guys turned around, the figure or shape dodged into the undergrowth. "What was it?" Gabe asked. "I don't know. It was big and it was real fast," Colt replied. And Fred spoke up sharply. "Let's get moving." There was movement coming from the left, right, and from behind them. The undergrowth seemed to have a life of its own, and the trees were shaking, and every once in a while a growl could be heard from either direction. And finally, Fred said, "Okay, I've had enough." And he raised his rifle, and Colt said, "Fred, you don't know if that's a person out there or not." And Fred replied, "I know enough," with fear and terror in his eyes. And Colt stared at Fred and shook his head back and forth. He fired one round to the left, and you could hear it ricochet off a tree, and then he spun around and fired around directly behind them into the brush at the last turn they took. And then he spun again and fired into the undergrowth to the left. He then lowered his rifle and pulled his pistol and fired 2 more shots to the front and said, "Let's go, boys." The men back at the cabin heard the gunshots, and Jeb and Todd grabbed their rifles and hopped on their horses bareback style, and they had not removed the bridles yet, so they had good control of the ride, and both men were yelling as they were riding towards the men on the trail. And Fred said, "Yep, that's what I was counting on," as the men approached with horses. The noises stopped, and not a sound more came from the right, left, or behind them. And Fred said, "We need for you to accompany us back." "What happened?" Jeb asked. "I'll fill you in when we get to the cabin," Fred replied. The men walked briskly and with a sense of purpose and fear, with the guys riding horseback behind them. And Fred said, Alright, let's get everything inside the cabin and let's get it done quick. We have about 50 minutes before the sun moves behind the mountain. We know it's going to get real dark real soon after that. And the men set about moving the supplies as quickly as they could and began storing them in the cabin and in a root cellar behind the fireplace. When the men built the cabin, they built it very sturdy, almost avalanche tough. That was one of the fears that the men had, was that a large snowslide would bury and collapse the cabin. And the men felt that if avalanche did occur, they could retreat to the root cellar and have at least 2 ways out. And the cellar was spacious, almost an equal size to the cabin, and it had a back entrance that was built with a dodge to the left and up about 9 stair steps, with about 6 by 8 landing at the top of the stairs, and was built with a fairly strong door, but they always thought it should be stronger. The exit area of the door was built with stone, abutments on either side, and the abutments extended 15 feet beyond the door, so that any large tree trunks would be deflected or forced to rest on the abutments, allowing for a crawl space, but mostly debris clear space to get out or start a tunnel to free themselves from the snowy grave. When the men finished moving supplies into the cabin and root cellar, they decided that it would be a good idea to pull the outside shutters closed and bar them with the locking boards. The men even put the locking boards up on the front door and the cellar door. Gabe and Colt were still pretty shaken by the events of the afternoon's walk from the mine, and both men were trying to estimate the number of whatever those things were. At best, they had calculated that there were probably 7, maybe 8, with the realization that they could be wrong. Then Dan started conjecturing about what got them so fired up. After all, the men have been in this area for over 6 years and nothing like that has happened before. And Fred just sat in his chair and remained silent, until the banter or the conversations became too much and he said, "Okay, enough. We have a long day tomorrow and we're going to need extra rest, since someone's going to be on guard while we work. Someone will have to watch our backs." And so the men moved off to bed, except Fred. He sat in his chair instead of the barred front door of the cabin. And the men had been resting for about 2.5 hours. All the men were asleep and the cabin was quiet. Even Fred had dozed off to sleep. The cabin was stuffy, and Gabe had opened the window to let in some fresh air, but he had the exterior shutters barred at the top and bottom of the 2 panels that met in the center of the window. However, there was a gap at the bottom of the shutter where the shutter and the windowsill met, and the gap was all of about 2 inches. As the creature approached the cabin, one of them took interest in the open window that was just above Gabe's top bunk and began sniffing intently at all the intoxicating odors and scents that were wafting out of the space between the shutter and the sill of the window. Gabe tossed and turned, and the creature squatted down so as not to be detected, while the other creatures moved around the cabin and tested the front door and the other locked shutter windows. The failure to find an entry point began to make the Alpha show signs of irritation with the group of creatures. While remaining quiet as possible, he was flailing his arms and making facial expressions in silence. The creature below Gabe's window stood up and began to push its fingers up into the crack of the shutter and sill. It felt something soft and interesting. It began to manipulate its fingers so that it started to gently pull Gabe's blanket through the crack. As the creature was doing this, the Alpha, who was standing 3 feet from the front door, lost his patience and let out a horrifying screaming growl. This startled everyone and Gabe, who was waking up, and feeling the blanket ripped off him and disappear under the window shutter, like a magician pulling off a tablecloth. Gabe screamed and fell out of his bunk as the creatures outside began screaming and howling while banging on the sides of the cabin. The turmoil and chaos in the cabin was a thundercloud of panic, and the men were terrified as the sounds of pounding increased and the howling turned into growling, and the loudness from the rage outside drowned out the cries of panic and terror and horror-filled yelling that was erupting in the cabin. As the creatures circled the cabin, they began to stomp their feet and hit the ground with their clenched fists. This, coupled with the howling and growls, and the insane sounds of the creatures chattering to and from each other, was a nightmarish symphony that no good soul should have to wake up to have to endure. The creatures continued circling the cabin, and Fred, cussing like a freshly minted sailor, began to unbar the door, and Colt, Dan and Todd jumped to keep him from completing the act. The four men wrestled the rifle and pistol away from Fred, and Colt punched Fred solidly in the chin, knocking him out. As this was playing out in the cabin, Gabe yelled, "Stop! Stop! Listen! It's gone quiet." And some 15 minutes passed, and there were no sounds, and Dan said, "Do you think we should look outside?" And Colt said, "We're not doing anything until the sun is up over the mountain. You got it?" And the men, except for Fred, all nodded in agreement. And the men threw water on Fred's face, and he came to with a vigorous attitude, and the men explained that they did what they had to, and that if he had a problem, then he could work the mine alone. And so, as the excitement of the night waned, the men started questioning Fred as to why he is acting so recklessly, and this was out of character for him. About an hour or so, the coyotes began to howl, and this sent the men back into a mild panic, as Fred finished the story of what happened up on the ridge, and that he never thought that they would pursue him here. While the men were extremely upset, and a few of them said that they would leave in the morning, and the others, after some long convincing, decided to stay and work the mine to the end of the month, and then they were out. The men were unnerved at every sound until the sun broke over the mountain. At sunup, the men gathered around the table and began looking at the assay papers, and as the richness of their fortune began to take shape, all the men decided that they would stay. The sun broke out over the mountain, and the early morning mist began to roll back into its slumber. The men with rifles drawn unbarred the front door, and the scene outside the cabin was a mass of equipment and tools just thrown about, and the number of large, medium and small footprints were uncountable, and the prominence of the whole area was punctuated by the large 25-foot tree trunk literally shoved into the ground upside down, so that its fresh roots, with chunks of dirt still clinging to them, were pointing to the sky. Well, this unnerved the men to where they were ready to leave the cabin at that moment, but through some carefully spoken words by Fred, they decided to get ready for work. Fred went and saddled up his horse and tied a rope to the tree and pulled it down and dragged it away to the other side of the barn. As he returned from doing this, he reminded the men by saying, "What they can put up, we can take down." The men were ready for the day, and they began to move to the mine, down the well-used trail. The men arrived at the mine in reasonably good spirits, considering the events of the previous evening. 5 men worked the mine, while 1 guarded the opening to the mine, and when someone would come out with a load of dirt and debris from the digging, he was always not far from the sight of the man on guard. And while at lunch, the men sat quietly at the opening of the mine and ate lunch and talked of the day's finds, when a screaming howl erupted from the tree line, and the trees seemed to be pushed over near the entrance to the trail back to the cabin. The men reacted in surprise and terror, and Colt, the man on guard, fired a rifle shot over next to the area where the tree had fallen, partially blocking the trail. It seemed like the forest around the area came alive, with trees shaking and the undergrowth was swishing and moving in all directions. Sounds of movement in the form of footsteps and thumps could be heard in all directions, other than the direction of the mine, which the men had pushed their backs up against. "Hey guys, I think we need to head back to the cabin. Whatever these things are, in time they're going to pin us up against this cliff face, and they will come for us, and we won't be able to do a damn thing about it." And Jeb replied, "Yeah, buddy, I think you're right. I don't want to get caught out here in the dark and then try to make it back to the cabin. Look, these things are just monkeys or something. Not going to do anything to us. Let's just keep working and get the money rolling in," Fred said with an air of confidence. "You mean after last night and what just happened, you think these things can't hurt us?" Todd replied jokingly. "I vote getting back to the cabin," Gabe said with fearful confidence. No, we're staying here and working our claim," Fred snapped angrily. "No, not gonna do it. I'm getting my things and I'm heading back to the cabin. We have a fighting chance there. Out here we're just sitting ducks. Dan stated in defiance. Ah, okay, fine. You just forfeited your share. Fred roared at Dan. I'm with you, Dan. No amount of money is worth my throat getting ripped out, Gabe stated. Me too. I'm out. Wait up, I'm out too. As all the others fell in behind Dan, leaving Fred still standing where he last roared about the whole affair, the men gathered their things, and 4 of the 6, including Fred, had rifles and pistols. The remaining 2 had just pistols, but pickaxes were carried by them. By now, it was about 1:30 in the afternoon, and their horses and mules were back at the cabin. The men walked into the mine area today. Gabe said, I wish we had our horses. We could ride like the wind back to camp. This just feels like eyes are on us and they're all around us. And Todd said, Hush, I'm hearing movement, off to the left, up there. Well, they may be moving up there, but something is definitely moving down off to the right of us. It's just barely behind us on the downslope. I see undergrowth and shrub bushes shaking and moving. I can't see anything else, Jeb said with a jittery voice. Boys, we're in trouble. I just saw something just in front of us, just at that bend in the trail, Cole informed the group. Okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to fire 3 shots in every direction, even you guys with the pistols. 3 shots, and then we're going to reload quickly, and then we're going to run like hell, Todd barked with authority. The men nodded, and they took aim and prepared to fire. In that moment, a loud, screaming roar rocked the gorge. It sounded like it came from behind them. Okay, boys, let 'em have it, Dan ordered. As the men let loose the volleys of gunfire, it sounded like something started running down the trail, and then stopped and dove off to the trail in the direction of the downhill slope. And Dan said, Reload, reload! As the men reloaded their weapons, loud chattering could be heard from the uphill side of the trail, but it sounded like it was some distance up the trail, and then it sounded like a herd of elephants was stampeding down the slope towards them. Run! Run, boys! Screamed Dan. The men took off at a frantic pace, while running Dan and Colt, who were in front of the group, would fire rounds up the trail on either side of the mountain slope. The men ran past the midpoint shelter and stash, and it was demolished. But none of the men stopped to take a look. They were about 1,400 feet from the cabin, a good quarter-mile plus. And when Todd screamed, Oh my God, there they are! As he was running and pointing up the mountain, and he began to fire up the mountain slope while running, and Gabe, who had a pistol, was firing as well. When Jeb yelled, Oh God, they're gonna catch us! And Cole could hear thumping of feet behind them. He didn't look back, but he definitely heard the sound of their large feet hitting the hard compacted soil of the trail. Now the men were about 800 feet away from the cabin, and then a resounding boom, boom, boom reverberated thunderous shockwaves through the expanse of the gorge and shook the men's intestines and the trees around them. And the 3 sticks of dynamite that Fred had brought with him from the mine exploded. The creatures seemed to panic, and the pursuit ended for about 300 feet. However, they resumed the hunt with a sense of extreme urgency, and the men were now locked in a death race to get to the cabin. The explosion seemed to give the men enough of a lead in the foot race and put the creatures off balance. In the determination of the hunt, the coordination of the creatures was fouled. The men soon rounded the last bend in the trail, and they ran into the clearing of the camp. The men were raging towards the front door of the cabin, where Jeb manipulated the inside locking mechanism that they had installed to keep out unwanted intruders that was hidden in the loose floorboard of the porch. As Fred was running up to the porch, he came to a complete stop and was in utter shock when he found himself looking at the upside-down tree that he had pulled down before they had left for the mine. Oh, good God in heaven! He spoke aloud to himself. They put it back up! As he spoke these words, bullets started whizzing by his head and past him, and the men were screaming at him to run like he has never run before, as the creatures were within 60 feet of him. He ran through the open door, and the men slammed it, and as they were about to place the first locking board, in its door jamb hooks The door was pushed about 3 inches open, and the struggle to keep the creatures from opening the door any further was joined, until Colt put his 12-gauge shotgun in the opening of the door and fired both barrels. And then the men were able to close and place both locking boards in the hooks, and thus finally securing the door. The cabin shook as the creatures, now enraged, began to beat on the cabin walls, and it seemed to be that they were trying every method to get into the cabin. But the cabin, I was built too tough. The screaming growls and howling of the pod of beasts, coupled with the pounding and thumping of the feet and fists on anything around the cabin, created a cacophony of sound, and the absolute terror of the men inside created an environment of frightening proportions. And as dusk moved in on the cabin from the sun setting over the mountain, the noise, it was intensifying, as the beasts were using large tree limbs as clubs against the cabin walls, and now the men could hear feet stomping on the roof of the cabin, and particles of dust and chinking used to seal the logs and planking of the cabin's roof began to fall like spiraling darts that left trails of fine dust in the air, now backlit by their lanterns. And Colt said, "Look, if they're going to bust that front door open, we need to fall back to the root cellar. So let's try and find things that we could block the passage up and create some kind of barricade to keep them out of the cellar. It will be our last chance, boys." And so the men set about moving furniture and other things that could be used to block them in the cellar. And they were doing this as the beasts were raging. They were attacking the cabin at full force. The men were about 25 minutes into getting the cellar in a state of readiness when the pounding on the cellar's back door began. And Todd ran up the cellar stairs and stood on the landing. He had his hands on the door and yelled, Hey guys, get this door. I ain't gonna hold much longer. We have to brace it, now!" And as he said this, his eye caught a glimpse of one of the beast's eyes looking back at him through a crack in the planking of the cellar door. It scared him to the core, and he backed away from the door, when the beasts seemed to pound on the door with a coordination of purpose. One of the door's planking boards splintered, and the beast's hand and half an arm reached through the opening in the door and was swiping at anything it could. The men arrived with extra boards and nails, and the men went about trying to repair and reinforce the door, but with the beast trying to grab them. Jeb grabbed a pickaxe, and with just barely enough room, he was able to swing it and lodge the pickaxe side of the axe in the forearm of the beast. This threw him forward, and his back landed against the door. The arm of the beast withdrew from the opening, but as soon as it did, another arm came through the opening, and it reached around the opening and grabbed Jeb by the face and raked its claw like nails across his face, almost ripping his right cheek from his jawbone. The pain, it was blinding. Jeb screamed and fell to the floor. Dan grabbed Jeb and pulled him from the landing and down the crowded stairs and tended to his injuries. Luckily, the attack missed both eyes, but the scars, they would be horrifying. And still the beast continued the attack at the cellar door and on the cabin itself. The men were able to drive off the enraged beasts from the cellar door with kerosene torches, and things seemed to quiet down for a while, as rocks then began to smash into the cabin's walls and roof. The men could still hear them chattering and stomping around. And with darkness upon them, this was a sleepless night that the men would never forget. Dan looked at his pocket watch and it said 3:07 a.m. He looked around and the men were beaten, and their sense of sanity was very much in question, and now they were down a man. Jeb lapsed into a coma from shock and was barely breathing. Just before 4 a.m. the attack started again, pounding on the walls of the cabin, footsteps on the roof, rocks being thrown at the walls of the cabin and roof, and a relentless pounding on the front door this time. It seemed that with every strike of their fist, it was weakening. And Colt said, "This door, it ain't gonna hold much longer, guys." And Todd replied, "There's some boards in the cellar, but we're a little short on nails." And Dan said, "Tear the bunks down, pull the nails out of them." As the men started to rip up the bunks, and the jamb on the front door splintered, and Colt, Dan and Fred rushed to put their backs against it to help brace it until they were ready to start nailing the extra boards to the door. But with the jamb of the door damaged, this was not going to be easy. Not with those things out there. While the men were working feverishly to get the materials together to reinforce the front door, the jamb on the hinge side gave way, and a 3 to 4 inch gap opened. The creatures were pushing hands and fingers through the opening, and Gabe and Todd was at the door trying to push it back into the jamb's location so that a board could be replaced. The creatures' screams were now streaming into the room directly, and the beasts' ear-piercing howls and high-pitched yells, and with an odour that made several of the men vomit when they first entered the cabin. And some of the men said they felt lightheaded and dizzy, almost like they were going to pass out. It was at this moment that Fred felt that they were losing the cabin, and so he said, "Hold the door, boys. I have an idea." He got up from holding the door with his back, and Gabe jumped in his place, and the door shuttered some more, but held. Fred raced down to the cellar, and the pitch of the attack seemed to shift in overdrive. The viciousness of the beasts was more pronounced and vigorous, and Colt exclaimed as his strength was waning, "We're going to have to make a run for the cellar soon, brothers." It was at this point that Fred came up and out of the cellar, and with all the other beasts attacking the cabin, he said with a calm, self-assured voice, "All right, guys, let's show them some hospitality." And with that, he lit the fuse on the joint sticks of dynamite. With the fuse sputtering, he stepped up to the door and was looking for an opening, and the fuse was dwindling. He found an opening in between the beasts and tossed it through the gap between the beasts, and it landed about 15 feet away from the door. He dove against the door himself and said, "Boys, push, 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 goddammit, push!" The gap of the door jamb closed, and 2 seconds later, a loud boom echoed through the gorge, and the door jamb fully splintered. The door and the men were blown inside the cabin some 10 to 15 feet, and their ears were ringing, and Gabe's were bleeding. The beasts were staggering and coughing, and a few of the beasts that were unaffected physically by the blast were running over to help and carry the beasts that were affected. It was almost as if the attack turned into a "let's grab everyone and get back home" feel, as the pod began to walk back up the trail towards the mine. One of the larger creatures turned back to look at Colt, Dan and Todd, who were standing in the doorway, and in a low, almost supernatural voice, it said,
Leave while you can.
"45 minutes later, dawn broke over the mountain. The creatures did everything they could to get in that cabin, but it was built too sturdy. The barn and the livestock were not touched during the night's events, and the cabin looked like a cyclone had hit it, and debris was thrown in all directions. And Colt said in a 1957 interview, "We rode out of that place with our lives, but not our sanity or our peace of mind." And when he was asked if he would ever go back, he replied, "If this happened to you, would you?" Today that gorge is called Ape Canyon. The whereabouts of the miner's cabin remains a mystery to this day. The location of the mine was physically located, however 2 months later it was obliterated by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. The men of the incident would all recount the story as it happened. Gabe only talked about it twice in his lifetime. As for Jeb, he succumbed to his injuries several months later. One time he was asked what it was like to be so grievously injured by a monster, such as what he had described. And Jeb replied, "It was like the hand of God seeking retribution." Not long after that interview, he passed away and was buried in a pauper's grave just outside Gage, Oklahoma. And Fred always said they were apes. He journeyed back to the cabin and the mine's location once, and upon his return to his home near Yakima, Washington, he began to write his book. He would always talk about the incident, but never spoke a word of what happened Or if anything, when he returned to the area 20 years later, some people quibbled about why he went back. Some said to bring one of the creatures to the world and they had run him out again. Others said he returned to find his gold that he'd stashed in one of the ravines that was part of the gorge. The incident at Ape Canyon is one of the most infamous and notorious Bigfoot lore stories in existence. Hopefully, we will find out other exciting things about this event, or at least you can listen to this retelling and get a good thrill. And did you know that, in 1963, there was a disappearance of a skier by the name of Jim Carter? His disappearance was odd and occurred under unusual circumstances, but that's a tale for another day. And remember, the ape men like peanut butter cookies, but not the lemon ones. Nobody likes the lemon ones. Logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will get you everywhere. Albert Einstein. Wow. What a chest-pounding take on this incredibly infamous story. Really enjoyed this one, Ed. Great adventure, great tension and suspense, and an all-round epic reconstruction of those famous times. As ever, guys and girls, you know the drill. Please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help with the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. If you're an aspiring writer or just want to have a crack at things like myself, then please do get in touch with me at the brand new email, which is contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. Of course, if you have any suggestions or requests of type of genre or type of cryptid you'd like me to feature on the show, please do feel free to leave that in the comments below, and I'll do my best to facilitate that. And if you made it to the end of this story, then please do leave the secret message in the comments below, which is peanut butter cookies. Much love and respect, guys, and above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.